Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you on Power Talk. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today, and happy early Halloween, trick or treat, go out, have some fun, dress up, and try to chill out. Maybe the world will calm down a little bit, but without further ado, it's an honor to bring back a cat. Really one of the most decorated music critics in the world has ever seen. The amount of writing, quality, interesting ideas, the books, the articles, the lineage. I don't know. It stacks up with the heaviest cats in the world, and I get a chance to do set 2 with him. Joel Selvin, welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thanks, Jake. I like the idea of being decorated. You know, Marty Ballin, the Jefferson Airplane founder, he always thought that we should all have little battle ribbons for our hit records and Grammy awards and such, so that, you know, they could wear them like the fruit salad on a soldier's uniform. Oh yeah, well, this was my Grammy back in '74, and yeah, decorated.
Dude, rest in peace, Marty. One of the hippest cats in the world. I mean, can you? I want to touch on this for a minute. Can you just talk a little bit about and how it ties into any one of your books, but the idea of the saxophone coming out of, like, you know, Lester Young and Sonny Rollins and even the, you know, Bill Haley and the Comets, and the saxophone was the popular lead instrument up through the early to mid 60s, and then, you know, it was this rock and roll, the advent of rock and roll, and John Cipollina picking up little $15 guitars and all types, and then all of a sudden the guitar became this popular lead solo instrument, and to this day it has just continued on. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about, from where you sit, that evolution from the saxophone to the guitar.
Well, there's really, actually, there's no shortage of guitar-based 50s rock and roll records, but you're right, the saxophone had a much more prominent part in the development of the music until the Beatles and the sort of British beat group model took over.
Yes.
And that's sort of an interesting history, because it emanates from the rhythm and blues records that were made in New York, and that's primarily the work of three guys, Sam the Man Taylor, Jimmy Wright, who plays on all the George Goldner records, like Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, Why Do Fools Fall in Love. And he started out his career in East Harlem with another young musician who named Thelonious Monk. Wow. So that's Jimmy Wright. And then the third one was, of course, King Curtis, who was from Fort Worth, Texas, and won an Apollo amateur night and decided to move when he was visiting his cousins, and decided to move back to New York. And he was just an immortal badass on the saxophone in every which way. I played on all the Coasters records, and at the same time he cut jazz albums for Prestige with Miles Davis's rhythm section, and was single most sought after session player in the whole twist era, all that. And then, out in the West Coast, you have Steve Douglas, who was the saxophone player in Dwayne Eddy's road band, who came back to Los Angeles to work sessions and became the central figure in what came to be called the Wrecking Crew, because he contracted that original Phil Spector session in 1962 of He's a Rebel.
Wow.
And Steve had a very interesting saxophone style, because he'd never heard jazz. He'd only been intrigued to play saxophone by the R&B records, the doo-wop records, and the 8-bar breaks in the middle. So, I mean, Steve was a thorough professional with years in the business before he ever heard a flatted note. And his style, which is sort of a synthesis of those other three guys with a lot of whole notes in it, is just been passed down through the years, and it reemerges most powerfully in the Bruce Springsteen E Street Band with the work of Clarence Clemens.
This is wait, I want to just stop you right there. I want to go back to
thumbnail sketch of saxophone.
No, that is. I mean, dude, you just nailed it. I mean, no, it's. But I mean, you wrote this. You wrote a book about electric guitars. I mean, it's more of a Hollywood-based thing, but I mean, this whole thing, this Guitar Hero. I know that was in the early '80s, and I mean, to me, it went from like, a beautiful sort of Freddie Green pulsating rhythm guitar into, to the point when like certain electronic music, rock and roll music, got so loud that it lost. Well, anyway, the guitar just took over, and even to this day, people are just setting up amps and blasting out guitars and still trying to go for these massive peaks. But I just wanted you to talk a little bit about, like, I mean, because Tommy Tedesco, Barney Kessel, those guys hated rock and roll, but they knew how to play it. And then there were guys like Dean Parks and Louis Shelton and Larry Carlton who came in, actually knew how to arrange for rock and roll music. In your mind, like, when did you, even before you wrote this book, when did you become? Were you hip and were you attracted to the electric guitar when you first heard it?
Oh, everybody was. The electric guitar was just a miracle of an acoustic marvel in every way. Especially once it came out, the background of the big bands, like you say, and it was really buried back there. But 50s rock and roll. I mean, that's a guitar solo in "Rock Around the Clock." Buddy Holly had lots of guitar solos. Cliff Gallup with Gene Vincent. James Burton with Ricky Nelson. Not to mention the soloists like Link Ray and Dwayne Eddy. So the electric guitar always had a strong role. But personally. It was not infatuated, smitten, slayed by the guitar until I started going to dances at the Fillmore and getting played at by people like Chuck Berry and B.B. King.
I love it. Oh, my gosh.
Magic Sam was a Chicago blues guy that played a lot in a small club in Berkeley. And he was somebody that just knocked me out, and I just couldn't get enough of him. There were, a few years there where I would go listen to anybody play a guitar if it was plugged in, and absorbed a lot of stuff.
What was it, the New Orleans house? What club?
Yeah, that was the New Orleans house. Yeah,
I knew it.
Griffin's place.
Oh my God.
That's wild, Jake. It's a little known outpost in the scene.
Well, you know why I know that? Because the greatest, the first
Mandrakes is much better.
Mandrakes is no. You know why? Because this is a band I was going to ask you about. Is they were actually the first. I mean, of course, as far as electric fusion, before Weather Report was a band called The Fourth Way. Did you know that band? It was Michael White.
Sure. Let's see. That's
Mike Knox. Yep.
And Michael White and
Eddie Marshall and Ron McClure.
They have an album. They have an album on Apple Records, I think.
You know what? It's so no. Actually, they got kiboshed. They got a 4-record deal on Columbia, but their residency, they used to cook at the New Orleans house. That's the only reason and they were really.
I remember that band. Yeah. Michael White was something really special. Yeah.
I mean, I want to, we didn't get a chance to hit on your most recent book. I mean, for people that are, I mean, it's a catchy title, Hollywood Eden, Electric Guitars, Fast Cars, and the Myth of the California Paradise. What was your motivation to write this book? Because, I mean, you're delving into that Southern California milieu, which has been prodded for decades. So what was the impetus for this book?
Yeah. Not exactly an untold story, but I wanted to write my Beach Boys book too, and
rightfully so, man.
This is my California roots that we're talking about. So all of that, like, in many ways, it's a companion piece to the book I wrote about San Francisco called Summer of Love. But really, it's an exercise in storytelling, and something that I wanted to do as a writer. It's not so much the material that we're dealing with, because golly, Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, these aren't like trade secrets or anything, but the way I meted out the material as starting with this locus of the University High School class of 1958.
Oh my God!
And winding up in the spring and summer of 1966, like 8 years later, without trying to go on beyond that at all, right? Just to like have this sort of self-contained slice of life, kind of serial adventure, and meanwhile, Nancy Sinatra is doing this, but back to Jan and Dean, and then on and on like that. So that's the motivation for it, and it all sort of ignited, I think, when somebody showed me the University High yearbook for that year, and I discovered that Jan and Dean and Nancy Sinatra and Bruce Johnston and the Beach Boys and Kim Fowley, the record producer, and Sandy Nelson, the drummer, and even the girl known as Gidget, all went to high school together.
Now, okay, that is mind-blowing to me. My first inclination, knee-jerk reaction, is to jump a few years ahead to the Lowell George class. Did that was that in 66? When was that class? Because, John Kahn, who yeah. Go ahead.
The University High graduate list is pretty impressive. Randy Newman, Henry Vestine, John Densmore, a lot of the guys from the LA punk scene. I think the band Fear, I think those guys all come out of Uni High. The University High is on the edge of Santa Monica and West Los Angeles, and it's Bel Air. It's the sunny slope of Beverly Hills. This has got to be one of the most privileged
right. Yeah, totally.
school districts in the country. But like before it grows loathsome, and there were like issues eventually because of busing and stuff like that kind of undermined the lily white elitism of it. But in 1958, that class, which was the first rock and roll class, right? 55 was Bill
Absolutely.
Haley and
Unbelievable.
all that. So that class really, that was a moment in time and a place that I just found irresistibly romantic. The idea of Sunset and Sepulveda being a four-way stop with crops growing on each corner just is beyond my imagination at this point.
Yeah, well, of course it is. So how did you start? Did you, Bruce Johnston, Nancy Sinatra? This is some of the most heavyweight stuff. How do you approach something like that? Were you writing based on, did you go back and try to connect with any of the still remaining cats from that time? I'm just curious about how you, how direct or how much primary
So there's
source.
so much out there.
Right.
There's so much out there on much of this. The obsessive record collector types have combed through this material and reported on their findings.
Yes.
So the first thing for me was that if I wanted to tell the story in the way I wanted to tell it, I needed to have the females in the foreground, because they're missing from all previous accounts.
Interesting.
It's been just entirely painted as a boys' club. And I needed to have, if this was going to be a property that would be eligible for a movie or a TV miniseries or some further life, it needed to have a strong female protagonist, something for an up-and-coming actress, right? It needed to have that thing for female readers to identify with. They don't want to read another story about how the Beach Boys got into fights,
Oh yeah, enough of that stuff.
With the cousin,
Been played out.
Blah blah blah. But so I met in 2014 when I first started to formulate the idea for this book with Jill Gibson, because to me, her story was just tucked way in the background, and she was just mentioned as Jan's girlfriend, who had broken up with him just before the car crash. And we had a cup of coffee over in Marin, and she agreed to participate, and that's what I needed. That was the key I needed. Now it took years more to get the whole thing together, but once I knew that I could get this primary character out of the dark and into the light of my story, and then I was ready to dig in. So yeah, there was a lot of primary stuff. I mean, Sandy Nelson's story is just not well known at all, and nobody bothered to go back over it. But
that's interesting to know too, because I want to go back for a second. This female character. Well, why don't you just? I mean, I'm not even hip to her. Can you talk a little bit, shed some light on this main character?
Jill Gibson was a sophomore at University High when she started dating Jan Berry, who was a freshman at UCLA, recently graduated from Uni High, and her older sister had been in Jan's class, and Jan was in a club with her boyfriend from the year before. I can't remember his name. He ends up involved in the Sinatra kidnapping, the boyfriend. But they start going out when she's still in high school, and he has his first hit, Baby Talk.
Wow.
So she was on board for all that, and moved shortly after high school, moved in with Jan, and then they break up just before the car crash. She became involved with Jan's manager, Lou Adler, and then had a brief moment where Lou Adler had her replacing Michelle Phillips in the Mamas and Papas. Oh. So that was sort of kind of a story arc as far as this went. But more importantly, Jill, her whole struggle to create an independent identity, to be something other than somebody's girlfriend or wife, to establish herself as a person whole and complete, that was a parallel issue for her entire generation. And she struggled with it in a particularly California way, and also, get this, burdened by extraordinary good looks. You say burdened?
Well,
yeah,
yes.
Because nobody took her seriously. And she saw herself as a serious, poetic, artistic person, and people would just look at her and say, man, what a fine chick. So that was her struggle. That was her internal dilemma, her conflict, and she goes through that sort of narrative that I outlined, trying to resolve those issues, as did her entire generation. Nancy Sinatra is another a subset in that same struggle. And in her case, it's all the more sort of dramatized by the fact that she has this enormously famous father whose shadow you just can't get out of. And she takes sort of routine or conventional routes into and it just went nowhere. I mean, it's embarrassing. Movie roles, horrible records, and just Hollywood fluff.
Right.
They were trying to remake her in the Annette Funicello vein. Okay.
Wow.
So that record of hers, Boots, that's not just a personal triumph of hers. That's like the most self-assertion any female pop vocalist had pretty much ever been allowed before. And so it also reflects that same kind of generational need to establish a whole and separate female identity of hers. And frankly, I'm surprised at how little has been written about Nancy Sinatra, given how important that record was, how vital and significant her career was, and the sort of drama and color of her life story and upbringing with the famous father and the kidnapped brother. So, that's another factor. Is like, where's the Nancy Sinatra story? Well, it's in Hollywood Eden.
This is really quite, as the years move along, what was the most significant class of the 60s in your mind?
Wow. I don't know that there's another locus like that.
I love it. I love it.
Where there's a group of people who all knew each other at high school, and Jan belonged to this car club called the Barons, and the Barons had other members that you know of, like they called him Pat O'Neill at high school, but Ryan O'Neill, and Jim Bruderland, who became James Brolin, Mr. Barbra Streisand. They were members of the Barons, and Jan's fabulous family home up at the top of the Bel Air Hills was the scene of many parties, and lots of people remember going to parties up there and hanging out with them. And Bruce Johnston lived just down the street a block or so, next door to Burt Lancaster. I mean, this is the upbringing these people had. It was very unique. Excuse me, nothing's very unique. It was unique and specific to that time and place.
I'm wondering if you could encapsulate, like I remember talking to the late great multi-horn, tuba, trombone, saxophone, the guy, beautiful cat, Howard Johnson, amazing session player and a brilliant cat. And he talked about Herbie Hancock, McCoy Tyner, Chick Corea, himself. They were born in this pocket of, post-depression, pre-baby boomer. And it's kind of a missed little pocket of time. And obviously the names that I just spit out there, they all had a very individualistic point of view. I mean, they had their heroes, but they really wanted to kind of blaze their own trail. I mean, when you talk about this collective of people, this sisterhood, brotherhood of people that are just connected to all sorts of folklore and lore that keeps getting bigger, and obviously a lot of wealth, but also sort of really at a time, in the late 50s when we were probably at one of the peaks of our economic prowess, prestige in the world. I don't know when Eisenhower wrote the military-industrial complex thing, but we really were it was like peak America. Is there a way to encapsulate from your research and from the book about, what their point of view was, not just artistically, but, the way they thought about how things worked and how the world works?
So the people in my book are all California natives. And they're born into a world that was so remote from the East Coast and the rest of the United States as to be entirely different nation state.
Right.
California in the 40s and 50s. This is before jet travel. The only thing that California was known for outside of the fruit was the Hollywood and the movies and the burgeoning television industry.
What about the gold?
Really,
what about the gold rush?
New York
the
just
gold
dominated.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
That's how people came to California.
Right.
These crazy missionary zealots and get-rich-quick lunatics that would endure any kind of hardship and ordeal to get a chance at it. And then, of course, none of the gold miners made the money. It was people who were selling stuff to the gold miners that made money. So that kind of established the template for California. No aristocracy, no inherited wealth. I mean, the Levi fortune, their grandchildren are our age, Jake. So it was really like a fresh, new society where you could become rich and you could become famous and you could become status right away.
No aristocracy.
Situation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, the show business aristocracy of Hollywood had lined Beverly Hills and Bel Air, and it was their progeny that were going to University High. And this not necessarily movie stars and like Alan Jones's son was in the class ahead of Jan and Dean. He went on to become a singer named Jack Jones. Mel, who was Daffy Duck and Porky Pig, and Mel Blanc. Mel Blanc's kid was there. Johnny Weissmuller's kid was there. The kid that played in Lassie was at University High. I mean, all this was like a collection of, and the other people's parents might have been in show businesses like studio employees, lawyers, accountants. So that was the aristocracy of that era, that time, that place. And they'd be supplanted in time by rock stars, by tech millionaires, by real estate developers. There's no Vanderbilts in California. There's no Carnegie Mellons, right?
Absolutely not.
It's Geffen and Disney and names like that. And so the California native was a unique and sort of special brand. And this particular time and place, these were particularly privileged youth who really didn't have to envision limits on their life. And in 1958, what greater, more heroic thing was there than to become a rock and roll star? That was better than being a professional football player. And these kids could dream that, but moreover, they could do that, right? Jan Berry was in the top 10 while he was a senior in high school. Phil Spector from Fairfax High, which is sort of central Los Angeles, more of a Jewish neighborhood. Phil Spector, he was number one on the charts the summer after he graduated.
Wow.
So there were doors open. The things were possible. And nobody thought otherwise. You know what I'm saying? Is Jan Berry could walk into a recording studio the first time in his life he'd been inside a professional recording studio, and suddenly some record executive has scooped him up and taken him into the record business. It's the Lana Turner sitting at Schwab's drug counter story, only this is true.
Yeah, I mean, did you? I'm just curious about the one thing that just continues to come back into my mind right now is just this idea of pop music today, in today's landscape. Some cats are incredibly talented, but there are also a good deal of cats who are basically, because of their looks and their vibe and their following, propped up to be music stars. They actually cannot perform live to save their lives. It's completely a lack of authenticity musically, and yet they're absolutely beyond wealthy, huge, iconic name recognition, and they can't even play, and they can't even sing. And we have the technology now to fix all of that. How did I sound? Terrible. Come up, we'll fix it. Did you put a point of emphasis on, regardless of whether their records sold a lot or just the mere fact that these people were being recruited solely on the raw talent that they had? There was no auto-tune. You just walked in, they said, this cat's got the ability, let's roll with it. I mean, there was a certain credibility threshold. Did you focus on that at all? Because that to me is also, this wasn't like, oh, she's gorgeous, we can sell this. I mean, obviously, it's always been a business, but because it was so sort of, rock and roll was just becoming a household word. I mean, did you focus on the authenticity of the artists themselves?
Authenticity. That wasn't such an issue in those days because it was still much more of a kind of part of the culture of the folk milieu that it was coming out of. I mean, for one thing, you're talking about talent and technical excellence. If you're looking for that, you haven't listened closely to Jan and Dean lead vocals. They're a long way from the kind of singing you hear, say, on the Beach Boys records.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that did make the West Coast pop scene possible was a new breed of session musician that developed there. Instead of being like old-time big band guys that looked down their nose at rock and roll, there was a group of young guys, Hal Blaine on drums, Tommy Tedesco, Glenn Campbell on guitar, Al DeLory, Leon Russell, Don Randy on keyboards,
absolutely,
Steve Douglas on saxophone. They showed up in jeans and T-shirts, and they were rewriting the whole idea of what studio musicians were like. Studio musicians, of course, that's a fairly recent phenomenon in the music business, sort of developing after the Second World War, radio orchestras.
Absolutely,
like that.
Totally.
But in New York, the New York guys sort of like formalized it and created that pool of talent there that was making all the records in New York. But those guys, like I say, they looked down their nose at this music, and they were older guys. The guys in Hollywood, they were all for it, whatever you want, and as a result, they were able to what's the word facilitate, enable. They were able to enable people like Brian Wilson and Jan Berry and Phil Spector, and those records that those guys made together, those changed the way records were made everywhere in the world. So that group came to be called the Wrecking Crew. Well, that was not a term that was really part of their lifetime. That term starts out in the 80s, but that's a group of somewhere between 20 and 30 musicians that were available for record producers in Los Angeles to draw from, and as a result, they were able to make these barrier-breaking, pioneering records that just the New York guys and couldn't match.
Well, Mr. Selvin, we have a game on this program called Name That Voice. This individual popped into my mind this morning because I talk about lineage and how I feel about you, and I just want to play this for you and pay attention to the content. We'll come back.
Max Roach recorded, and I was privileged to be the A&R man, the Freedom Now suite. And that was just when the Freedom Rides were going down south, and we were all in the studio, and right afterwards, as soon as the record was released, it was on the Candid label, we were banned in South Africa, so we figured we'd done something. But no, it's not only Joe Henderson. All through the years, Duke Ellington used to tell me, he says, I'm writing about my people in these songs, in this music. And there were any number, the blues, if you listen to the blues singers carefully, they were talking about this society as well as their own blues, etc. Jazz has been a very awakening form of, well, I call it the spirit of this country. And I'm hoping it's going to come back now, because some of the younger players are beginning to understand that, and some of the older guys, it's something about the music that keeps a lot of guys going. They're still doing the same thing.
Well, I've been in... All right, this is going to be a reach for you, but this man was a little bit on the scene before you. This is maybe around the time of your Berkeley High days, but he, East Coast, pugnacious, tenacious, social commentator and music journalist. Do you want to take a guess?
Oh, I couldn't even imagine it, It's a good rap, though.
Good rap, and I can't believe I ever even got to him. Rest in peace. That was Nat Hentoff.
He lived for so long.
What's that?
He lived into his 90s.
Dude.
He was around forever.
I can't. One day I just called his publicist. Somehow he was kind of sequestered away in his little studio, and he was so irascible. But yet we did these cosmic interviews, and he's talking about John Coltrane incorporating Indian music. I mean, the guy was talking directly to these cats. But I wanted to focus on. You said Magic Sam, and I know that was more about the electric, about plugging in, but as it relates to all those Mississippi Fred McDowell, all the blues guys, the Arhoolie cats, can you talk about who you really got off on as it relates to, Nat was talking about jazz being the spirit of this country, or Duke Ellington talking about, this is the music of my people. Especially with those really original blues cats that you would see up close and personal. Are there a couple that stood out for you as far as what they were really commentating on through their songs?
So, 1967 and 68, I dropped out of high school and was working as a copy boy at the San Francisco Chronicle, and living in a 40, 50 unit apartment building in West Oakland, where I was the only white person under 65 years of age.
Get me some pictures of that, dude. I need to see that immediately, dude.
The building's still there.
No, I mean you and the brothers and the sisters, man. That's the greatest story ever.
No, it was a full, cultural experience, and but I was drenched in the whole thing. The Showcase was a nightclub about 3 blocks away, and there was a 24-hour coffee shop on the corner where the entertainers used to hang out after the shows. I remember seeing Ike and Tina and the Ikettes and all the hookers. And you couldn't tell the hookers from the Ikettes. It was hilarious.
First of all, I just want to stop you right there because I just want to drop.
Tons of shows.
I want to tell you something. First of all, was it called the Streets of Paris? Somewhere they used to pour liquor into people's coffee cups, and then Don Barksdale owned the Showcase. I think the basketball player. But go ahead.
Yeah. John Barksdale was a basketball player. Yeah, big and he had another club, the Sportsman's. Yeah,
that's right.
You have a lot of knowledge on this. That's pretty deep there, Jake.
Because I've interviewed all the West Oakland.
Saw Marvin Gaye there.
Yeah.
Saw Temptations there. Saw B.B. King there a couple times. Saw Jackie Wilson. I mean, and this tiny little club, and you are the only white person in there. And there was also a great black radio in Oakland, KDIA and KSOL.
Absolutely.
So I was very much drenched in that kind of music at the same time that I was, dropping acid and going to the Avalon and Fillmore. But I always gravitated toward that sort of black angle. I mean, even at the Avalon, it was Bo Diddley that was my favorite Avalon act, and my favorite guy at the Fillmore was Chuck Berry. So the Grateful Dead were on the bill, and they were okay, a little blues band with a pretty good guitar player, and sort of a burly-chested guy singing blues. It wasn't bad. They evolved into something larger, and I watched them do that. It was sort of like learning in public. But the black thing really had my ear. It really and the hippie thing was interesting and enveloping in its own way. But so you were asking about specific things like B.B. King was this amazing personality. I mean, he really understood what his art was about, where he came from, and what he represented in every regard, right down to the most sort of granular detail. And if you were to be able to spend time with B.B. King, say at his hotel room after a gig or backstage before one, it was like going to a postgraduate seminar.
Wow.
And he was this kind, gentle, penetrating intellect who saw these people interested in his culture and realized that this was an ember and he wanted to blow on it. And he would sit there and blow on it. And that was something that was going on all around me, right? Because also in San Francisco at that same time were guys like Mike Bloomfield and Elvin Bishop and Charlie Musselwhite, who were part of that ember and blowing on it themselves. So 1967, 1968, there was a lot of music that really meant something, that stood for something, and wasn't just some gimmick to get on the charts. I mean, not that that isn't a legitimate goal in life, hit records, what fun and everything, but somehow it was more important for me as a journalist to go out into East Oakland and interview Jimmy McCracklin and dig in to what it was like to be in the beginnings of the Oakland R&B world and those guys that made those records.
I need you to go. I cannot believe you just dropped it.
I was living in.
Please talk about the first, how you connected with Jimmy McCracklin. That is so cool. I mean, that dude. Please, I mean, and also, for just a naive 43-year-old white boy, can you just, like, with BB, you talk about this granular information, postgraduate seminar. I mean, can you just go a little bit, specific about something that really turned you on your head, or something you can relate to the audience about this granular? Because what I'm hearing today, just taking country western music, I mean, that's a different genre altogether, but I'm just hearing like so much, just so much played out, very superficial messaging about, family and this, worship music, and you're drinking a beer. But I'm like, this stuff, the cats that you saw up close and personal, McCracklin, they were really riffing. And I just, could you talk a little bit about that granular knowledge of BB and how he knew his lineage? Because it's my, I tend to think that younger cats don't necessarily know where they came from, and it's really hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you came from.
So B.B. King was a grand autodidact. And he carried with him wherever he went, these self-help books and just absorbed massive amounts of that kind of information. Likewise, at that point was tape cassettes were kind of like, just early, high-end deal. But he had a portable cassette player, and he had all kinds of records on tape of things I'd never heard. So there's B.B. King's Hotel Suite, where I first heard T-Bone Walker, where I first heard Charlie Christian. And those were like things that B.B. had, that he was like explaining his background and how he came to understand. This T-Bone Walker, he said, was the first person he ever heard play a single line guitar solo on electric guitar. Because B.B.'s cousin was Booker White, so he grew up hearing all this stump blues, as they called it, out in the cotton patch shit from Mississippi. But the more sophisticated stuff that had brushed up against the big band jazz in Texas and Chicago and New York, that's a little bit remote from there, and that's where where T-Bone Walker comes in, and where Charlie Christian on Benny Goodman records starts for him. So those things were things that BB was very, very knowledgeable about, and had the teaching materials on hand if you were, going to be interviewing him after the show in his hotel room. I remember another, a session on a motel room floor with Bobby Bland.
Oh my God!
Where he was drinking gin out of a bottle and mixing it with water in his mouth that he got out of a picnic thermos. So he'd lift the picnic thermos and turn the little spigot and then swish the gin and water around in his mouth. And he had a new record that I don't believe was ever released that he was playing me. And we were talking about a lot of subjects. And I mean, this stuff was incredible knowledge for me as a 20-year-old just coming into the world and the business. And I remember the question of could white people sing the blues came up, and
right.
That was sort of a pre the phrase cultural appropriation.
Totally.
Piece of debate that went on, and it was useless debate, but it still, I wanted to ask Bobby Bland about it. And Bobby Bland said, "Who's that cat that wrote Fire and Rain?" It was that'll tell you what time this interview was taking place, because it was just on the radio.
Wow, it's like
I said,
70,
that's James Taylor. He says, that cat, he says, that cat knows pain.
Totally spot on, dude. Spot on. And then for the record, for the audience that doesn't know that, James Taylor at the time was in a psychiatric ward writing letters to an imaginary girlfriend, and that's where it spawned. That's unbelievable stuff. Those guys were... Then I want to ask you, because, I mean, Garcia was an avid taper, and that's why he never had an issue with a lot of the Deadheads, even though some guys in the band hated the tapers. Do you think that BB, the tapes that he was carrying around were actual recordings that he made himself?
No. They were old records.
Oh, these were actual records.
But
they weren't cassette.
He couldn't carry records. Yeah, you couldn't carry records around. I don't know how many T-Bone Walker records were around in 1968.
Yeah, right, that's true.
You know, I certainly didn't own any. And so no, those were records that he listened to as a musician growing up, and he kept them with him, and put them on cassettes and listened to them as like his sort of traveling library of music.
I want to read you this. You brought up Musselwhite. I think this is going to bring a smile to your face when I interviewed him. He said, but I need a little bit of context. He said, he goes, I probably never would have left Chicago if they hadn't had the underground radio out on the West Coast. I didn't know about it until I got out to San Francisco. One station was called KMPX. Big Bill Donahue, Vaco, and Dusty Street were the DJs on that radio. Those guys just brought records from home and played whatever they wanted to play. They were playing hillbilly and blues and gospel and jazz. You could walk into these stations with your own records or ones you'd made, and they'd play those too. It was wide open. They weren't this is the most profound thing, Selvin. They weren't playing me on the radio in Chicago, but they were playing me on the radio out there in California. That's what brought me and a whole lot of us people out there to the West Coast. After they heard us on the radio, we had a following and we could get all these club gigs. The whole West Coast was really the place to be. It reinforced your feelings about the situation. I mean, can you just talk about that whole magic of people who were struggling to... I mean, Musselwhite was sweeping floors in a factory in Chicago. He's making records, and they're getting played in San Francisco and Oakland, and they're not even being played in Chicago. And that was not a rare occurrence. Can you just talk about that kind of... Well, to me, it just was added to the magic of the scene. And ultimately, like you said, we're talking about these guys, can the White Cats play the blues? Well, Mike Bloomfield could play seriously mean blues guitar, and so could Harvey Mandel, and Musselwhite could blow the blues. But it never would have happened without kind of underground pirate radio.
Well, it wasn't pirate. It was real FM radio.
Yeah, that's right. KMPX.
And midnight to 6. It was a foreign language station that had what they called block programming. Block programming was the thing where, between 4 and 8 we programmed for this audience. Between 8 and 12 we programmed for this audience. And so this former classical music DJ out of Detroit named Larry Miller, he rented them midnight to 6 and started just playing all kinds of goofy stuff. But he was addressing it to the growing kind of hippie population of San Francisco. This be like late '66.
Totally.
And I mean, honest, the hour before from 11 to 12 was the Turkish hour. I remember listening to the Turkish music just before Larry Miller came on.
Wow.
And Larry was completely loose and crazy, and the entire city of like-minded people started tuning in. It was like hippie radio, and it was an instant moment. And Big Daddy Tom Donahue, he was a escapee from Top 40 radio. He'd been ruling KYA, and every night he'd come on. He said, "I'm here to clean up your face and blow your mind." So he recognized opportunity there, and he kind of like took over the station and turned it into a 24-hour station, and suddenly this music that was just coalescing out there in the culture had a media outlet. I mean, the top 40 radio was just incredibly inane and puerile at that point. And these people, as Charlie says, I mean, they were bringing their records from home, and you could hear anything. And new records of any kind of hip variety could get on the radio. Because there wasn't a lot of that, right? You know, there were just a handful of records in '66 on LP that were really hip. You know, I remember like the Blues Project was this band from New York, and Love from Los Angeles, and you know, maybe the Jefferson Airplane first album. Not much out of San Francisco in '66. So the folk music was part of the diet. Like Dave Van Ronk had a big hit record with Cocaine. That's something he'd recorded like several years before, and all of a sudden it's been slammed on this underground radio station, and he's playing to 3,000 people at the Masonic Auditorium. Like all this kind of anomalous stuff was happening because there was this one radio outlet. And yeah, you know, they jumped on Charlie Musselwhite's Southside Sound System. Cristo Redentor was just, you know, blasting out of
nailing
the
this stuff,
airwaves.
unbelievable.
You know,
I mean,
he'd
like
come out here with his band, and they'd work, and you know, they thought they were in heaven. There was great grass, fantastic willing females, and lots of gigs and people that go to the gigs. What's not to like?
But just for the record though, because Bloomfield and Musselwhite, I mean, Bill Graham, they were Bloomfield and company were the ones that hipped Bill Graham to the original masters, the B.B. Kings and the Muddy Waters from Chicago, and then that's when they came out to start playing. Is that right?
Bill didn't know much about the music scene when he got into it. He just, you know, sensed an opportunity.
Sure.
And the first really important band to play in San Francisco was the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. They came in March of '66, and they just put the entire music scene on their ear, without question. They played a bunch of gigs for several weeks. They were around town, and they were already in their East-West things, so they'd, you know, gone into the LST, but they were doing the improvisations that these San Francisco bands, mostly former folk musicians, were sort of fumbling around at. And here they were with Howlin' Wolf's rhythm section, just magnificent in every regard. So the Butterfield Band just made a huge imprint on the early San Francisco scene. And Gravenitis, who was sort of a behind-the-scenes central figure to the whole white Chicago blues thing, and had been long pals with Butterfield and wrote Born in Chicago and all that, he'd mapped out San Francisco since the beatnik era. He'd bounced back and forth between Chicago and San Francisco. So he sussed the whole thing out, relocated to Mill Valley, and when Bloomfield peeled out of the Butterfield Band, they put together Electric Flag over in Marin County. Musselwhite came out with Mandel. Selvin left the Butterfield Band at the end of '67, and he came out and, you know, started his band out here. It was really obvious to all these guys in this dried up and blown away Chicago scene that where the action was right now was San Francisco, and there was good money and places to play and lots of great musicians around. So yeah, all those guys sort of gathered out here, and Graham leaned into Bloomfield. It was the most garrulous guy in the world, you know. Yeah, Bill, you know, you really need to have B.B. King here, you know.
Right.
Oh, yeah, we got to get Junior Wells and Buddy Guy out here. Like, Bill didn't know who these people were. I mean, when Mike Bloomfield stopped whispering in his ear, he had a guy named Paul Barada working for him and told him, "Yeah, we got to book this group, Cream, Bill. Cream, you'll really dig them, man." You know. And the same, you know, with Jimi Hendrix. You know, Jimi Hendrix was a known entity in June 1967 in San Francisco because KMPX had an import copy of that album, and they were slamming it. I'm telling you, Jake. Not just Red House or Foxy Lady or Purple Haze all of them.
Right.
And
right.
Bill brought him in, yeah. He's opening act for the Airplane and Gabor Szabo. Gabor Szabo, was second billed on that act.
Well, I'm pretty sure, and that, what's so legendary about that is that Jimmy Keltner was probably playing drums on that with Gabor, because he was in his band for a long time at that time, and nobody really knows that. But when you were I
know Gabor Szabo kept him out of Derek and the Dominoes.
Yeah, well, I'm still going to get. I'm getting you to Keltner as soon as possible.
The Dominoes, and he was as soon as I'm done with this Gabor Szabo session, and Jim Gordon said, "I'll be there tomorrow."
Yeah, well, I mean, but with because you were talking about Fire and Rain, so it's fair to say though that did Chuck Berry and Bobby Bluebland and these guys, B.B. King, were they just showing up in the Chitlin circuits or West Oakland before San Francisco, or when was the first time they hit the Bay Area? Was it only after Bloomfield pulled Graham's coattails to the whole thing?
The Chuck Berry thing was him showing up like fifth or fourth billed on one of those package shows that Jackie Wilson was headlining at the Oakland Auditorium.
Wow.
And Ralph Gleason, the Chronicle columnist, caught the show and went nuts over Chuck Berry in the paper, and Graham booked him based on that. So, each one of these has a different story. The over at the Avalon, they were a little bit more aware of this stuff than Bill was. Like they didn't have to ask who Bo Diddley was. And Bo Diddley, oh man, the hippies loved Bo Diddley, and Bo Diddley loved the hippies, man. He was a regular at the Avalon, and those shows were always packed, and he was full of improvisational stuff and really good humor. You may have heard the Bo Diddley Grateful Dead jam that's on some Dick's Picks from the Academy of Music in New York.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, I dig that that it was all. I just dig that you were hip to it all, man. I'd like to think that I would be, but I don't know. I have another. I just did this interview.
Oh no, it was a sport. You would have been without any question, because it was.
I hope so, man. I just knew
like information was readily exchanged. This band opened at the Fillmore last week. You got to check them out. Oh, there's this group, Creedence Clearwater, over at Gino and Carlos. They're really happening. All that stuff was in the air, and it was a sport. It was like, there's another new band next week that's going to be just as good as the last one you saw. So. It was rewarding.
I got another Name That Voice for you. You take a listen to this. This is a great story. Just did this interview, and we'll come back.
We did the Tracy Nelson song, Down So Low.
And Mother Earth.
This was the it was Jimmy Giuffre did the chart.
No, he didn't.
Bobby had Jimmy Giuffre do the chart. The chart was so far out that we had like four of the guys. No, you have to hear this story. We had like four guys from the Edwin Hawkins Singers as the background singers in this track.
This is so great.
David couldn't find the first note to sing. He couldn't find where the tonic was. He didn't know, and we were laughing our sides off, and I couldn't blame him. The guy didn't know where to, because the Giuffre chart was so atonal. It was so dissonant. It was so weird, and this beautiful spiritual type song. And the guys I'm in the control room, and the guys in the Edwin Hawkins Singers, I'm listening to them. One guy saying, "What the fuck?" He's listening. Dude, he's got the sheet music in front of him. He's going, "What the fuck?" David can't find the first note to sing. He doesn't know what key it's in. And I'm like peeing in my pants because it's so funny.
Honestly, all right, that was an interview I did. You mentioned the Blues Project earlier. I just had an opportunity to interview Steve Katz, who also was, and what he was talking about.
Oh, wow.
He was in the original incarnation of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And he was saying that
sure,
they made a couple of, they had started to get some momentum. They had a couple of big hits, and they had a huge amount of studio time in San Francisco carved out, and Jimmy Giuffre, Bobby Colomby, who was his cousin, was their manager, was also, I think, Monk's manager. Thelonious opened for them. So anyway, he brought Jimmy Giuffre in to write these charts for this one song, and they couldn't. David Clayton Thomas was cracking up because they could not find the tonic. They couldn't find what key it was in, so they were cracking up. But what I wanted to ask you about, this is what he said. He goes, this is what Kat said. He goes, after we had hit records, we went out to San Francisco, and we went to the studio for 3 months. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Simon and Garfunkel, and Janis went to Clive Davis and told him we wanted a studio in San Francisco for a guy named Roy Halley, CBS Records on Folsom Street. Were you hip to Roy?
Yeah, it was around the corner from the Chronicle. I used to hang out there quite a bit.
Can you talk about? I need it because I'm not hip to this. Go ahead.
Halley was this, austere Scottish audio engineer from New York who'd done the Boxer with, the elevator shafts and all that, and his buddy Roy Siegel, and they came out from New York and started a Columbia recording studio operation there. That also had an adjacent A&R operation. That Clive thought the San Francisco was going to be the Nashville of rock, but that didn't really work out too well. I mean, they signed all the terrible bands, and it didn't really do anything with it. And eventually, David Rubinson took over the studios, and Columbia and those guys disappeared. But what a culture clash, okay?
Yeah.
Like you got the Sons of Champlin, who are the most arch Marin County hippies in the world. And Clive assigned them to Columbia Records, and they come into Columbia Studios, and there's Roy Siegel, this guy who's just finally stopped wearing a necktie into the studio, and he looks at these hippies, and he says, "Boys, you see these machines here? They're here to make money." They thought he was hilarious. I mean, come on, no, man, that's not money.
Dude, I cannot stop. First of all, they were the funkiest blue-eyed soul band ever. I can't stop listening to their album.
Oh, they're the greatest. Just ask the
ever.
guys from the Dead, man.
Dude, I keep listening to Terry Haggerty.
Was badass.
No, Terry Haggerty. Dude, I listened to Garcia said he was one of the most influential cats on him was Haggerty. I can hear it. It's unreal. It's unreal.
No question. I'm still smoking Terry Haggerty weed.
Dude, Terry Hagalicious, man. Hagalicious, man. Hagalicious. I mean,
Hagalicious.
Dude, Terry's I love this stuff, man. I mean, so you're telling me you maybe hit a writing block and you'd go out, grab a cup of coffee, and go over to Folsom Street to the studios. I mean, how?
I was done with work,
Yeah.
Go down, and hang out and see who's in A, see who's in B, see who's playing games in the front room, see what's getting mastered by George Horn, smoke a couple of J's with, somebody. There was always something going on, and everybody was, always willing to let me hang out. Journey, Steve Miller, Sly Stone, all those guys were down there. I mean, I have a copy of Blood on the Tracks, the New York pressing that George Horn gave me. I said, "Oh, is that a new Dylan album?" He goes, "Yeah, here, you take it home." I mean, it's like wow, George. But George just died, by the way. He was the best mastering engineer in town. So no, San Francisco was like this little center of Columbia. It was a very good little studio. Had a really cool B studio, had a really big A studio. Glenn Kolotka and Michael Fusaro, excellent engineers, and the Halley was so strange. He was one of these guys. You'd walk down the hall talking to him, and he'd stop for a minute and start snapping his fingers and listening to the resonance. Like, oh, really? Oh, okay. Roy Siegel was much more sort of like, Manhattan type, but Halley was a real sort of spacey, airy, heady kind of guy. And I think they spent like almost the first year recording A, the Art Garfunkel solo album, and B, the Paul Simon solo album, because neither of those guys would go into a studio without Roy Halley. He was the Simon and Garfunkel team guy that had done all that shit since Tom Wilson and Bob Johnston stopped working with him back in the first or second album, whatever it was. And so he guided them through that. And those were incredibly elaborate, ridiculously overpriced affairs that involved lots of travel and many different musicians and all kinds of remote locations. And I didn't remember that Blood, Sweat, and Tears was in there in some lengthy process, but there is an album that I'm thinking that nobody noticed that probably was.
That's exactly no, and I have to go
deep.
The
second album,
you nailed it. Well, then there's a Jimmy Jufrey. It was arranged by him, which is just insane.
Jimmy Jufrey, yeah. I mean, I'm dying to hear this now.
No, I mean, I'm going to get. No, I'm telling you, dude. I mean, these are the stories that. Okay, so there's two more. There's a couple more. Two more questions here in set 2 that I want to get to. I
watched Hallie try to produce the first Journey album.
Oh, please talk to me. Rest in peace, Herbie Herbert, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And they were all juiced up and sitting in the studio while Hallie sat there and puffed on his fucking pipe for 3 hours waiting for a microphone to be delivered.
Holy cow. Whoa, dude. Hallie, man. The dude had some balls. I will say that. I love it, dude.
Oh, he was totally in charge. I mean, you went into his office, there was a stack of 5 Grammy Awards on his desk, okay? They were just tumbled up against each other.
Right. Right. He's like, you want the yeah.
Just to sort of let you know where you were, you know?
I need the Selvin, I need as much information as you can tell me about the lore of this studio, the Pacific High recorders. What can you tell me about that?
Well, that was Richie Olsen's studio. Richie was in the Charlatans.
Oh, that's right.
And he was a trained musician. He could read music and play clarinet and stuff like that. You know, he wasn't just another dumb hippie. But yeah, that was his studio. It was around the corner from the Fillmore West in an alley off Market Street. And there's some incredible sessions there in like 1969 to 71. Of course, you know, Working Man's Dead, 5 days in Pacific High. There's also some Van Morrison stuff that's really great out of there. It was very much a sort of, you know, working studio on the scene for a few years. And like I say, it wasn't like Leo Gardekalka's Golden State Studios, which had been in business a long time, was sort of old school audio. This was hippie audio. This was, you know, Richie Olsen out of the Charlatans, and the Dead guys were involved in building that.
Yeah, so Dan Healy was building that stuff.
Pacific High thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just
Healy and
you know, you said something to me last time that was quite frankly mind blowing, and I haven't transcribed it or anything. I've been sort of just treasuring the audio of it, but I mean, you crystallized for me. I guess Phil Lesh said that, you know, after 75, coming back in 76, things were never the same, and I never really understood why until you told me that basically the cats were like, well, let's see if we can all do our own solo things, and Billy Kreutzmann couldn't even afford a condo. And so it was pretty evident that they needed the Dead. I mean, it was just ultimately like, recently, just at a recent show, Dead Incorporated or Dead and Company, whatever you prefer, Billy got sick, so they had a drummer filling in for him, great drummer. And at the end of the second set, Mickey, in fine fashion, walked off the stage. I guess he, was trying to bully this guy, and it didn't work. And he had to apologize after the show. But I mean, Phil Lesh's club is in serious trouble, and San Rafael and Terrapin Crossroads, I hear it might be closing. Not that I'm cheering for this stuff, because I love all of those guys, but
I think the lease is up on Sunday.
Dude, you're right on. I mean, it sucks. It's a byproduct of COVID, and I hope. Anyway, it was a great venue. I wanted you to talk a little bit about, basically, like, when you look back at a band like the Grateful Dead, in your mind, what is their what is their legacy in terms of like actual? I mean, as a band, we know them as this. I mean, Melvin Seals, guys that joined Jerry's band for a long time, just knew them as they saw their shows being advertised on billboards, and there was complaints about people leaving trash around the venues, and I mean, they didn't know anything about the music. Do you feel like you were tapped into the Dead's music from the get-go? Ultimately, do you think that they became better musicians over time? And the other thing that's confounding to me, one reason I brought up the Mickey Hart thing is because Mickey could never. Matt Kelly told me that Mickey wanted the job in Kingfish, but he really couldn't keep time. New Riders tried Mickey. It didn't work out in the studio. He could never really be a trap drummer. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about it. Go ahead.
You don't use Mickey Hart for his timekeeping ability.
No way.
That's not what Mickey does.
No, I did.
What Mickey does is much more special than timekeeping. And he brings a world of percussion into any place he goes. He has this expansive view of rhythm and what he calls the vibratory universe that so totally informs whatever musical enterprise he's a part of. It just changes it from a fundamental point of view. So, he's rough on this on the 3/4 turnarounds. There's no question about that.
Right? No, he made that. No, I agree with you. He brings an element of tribalism to the band.
The thing he does that other people can't do.
Totally.
Oh yeah, all the funny time signatures and the spirit of adventure and the exoticism. All that's coming from Mickey Hart and his Cossack soul. He's a very dear friend, and I just think the world of Mickey. He can be difficult and thorny personality, but it's always because of some artistic issue. I mean, he's not like a diva, right?
Totally.
It's really about artistic integrity with him, always. And the Dead, if they become better musicians, what an interesting question that is. I asked Jack Cassidy about Phil Lesh because Jack showed up in San Francisco having been playing the electric bass for many, many, many years. Phil Lesh, who was on the bandstand at the same time, had just picked up the electric bass.
Right.
And was a trumpet player who was fumbling at learning how to play the electric bass so he could be in an electric rock band. And I asked Cassidy about how deft he was. And Cassidy was very impressed at Phil's ability to learn the instrument, learn it quickly, and learn it in public. And he says that by 1968, 69, when Garcia and Lesh were sort of pushing the band out of the electro blues band factor in the more experimental zones, that he had really mastered the fundamentals of the bass and was pioneering new areas. And Cassidy's not like well met guy. I mean, he wouldn't say that if he didn't think so. So that was interesting to take his thing on that. Kreuzmann's always been a terrific drummer. I don't know that he's gotten any more. Mickey's brought him along in terms of his sense of musicianship without any question. Although they have a very contentious relationship. And neither of them like playing with Phil. Mickey described his bass playing as buzzing around like a bee.
No, wait, hold on a second. You're telling, because I always thought Phil, but here's the thing, Selvin, So, Jerry, Phil was working for the post office, and Jerry's like, hey, man, you want to be in the band? He's like, here's a bass. He showed him the notes, and obviously he played in public. And Cassidy wouldn't just offer that as, some pity. Cassidy was playing in D.C., he's a serious player. So, but I'm listening to Dead Incorporated, and I love Oteil Burbridge. He's a great player, but it's like I'm listening to I mean, when I listened to Phil, that's what made The Dead. It was, I mean, obviously he just was on his own.
So
and
everybody in The Dead thinks that they are the reason. It's special. Honest, every one of them.
Really? Bobby too? Bobby thinks that he was the reason?
Oh yeah, Bobby, you know, secretly they all think that they are the reason it's special. Not, you know, Jerry, of course. Jerry's Jerry, and they all like, you know, he was the hub and they were the spokes, but they also all thought they were Jerry's best friend. They didn't say that about each other. You know, Phil never said, "Oh, Bobby's my best friend." Right. No, Jerry was his best friend. Bobby said Jerry was his best friend. Mickey said Jerry was his best friend. Billy said Jerry was his best friend. So that'll give you some idea of the sort of group dynamics there.
Wow.
But yeah, Bobby has, by the way, really improved.
Yo, dude, Bobby's Bobby. Listen, if you're gonna play with Alfonso Johnson and Billy Cobham for years, you're gonna get a lot better. I mean, you're just gonna get better. Period. Which he did with Bobby and the Midnights.
His chops are up, but I think I'm very impressed with his nuanced vocals. He really has grown into a sort of like, you know, Merle Haggard level of nuanced singing, and I've heard him do it at his home studio, TRI, which has this extraordinary Constellation sound system that John Mayer invented, and I was staggered at given the proper environment and the material, you know, how incredibly nuanced and deep and profound a singer Bobby had come to be. Because, you know, singing was not something the Grateful Dead paid any attention to at all in the earliest part of their lives.
Absolutely. Did you go to Club Front? Did you have a chance to get down there? What was the first time you went there?
Sure. I was there a number of times, you know, doing interviews, picking up grass. I mean, you know,
this is fantastic. No, I'm just saying, you know what it is, Selvin? It's so hard for me, man, because a lot of those cats now, I mean, Bobby's the one exception. They're all bubble wrap. They're all, like, the thing that's so cool is that they respected you, but everything, Journey, Santana, Quicksilver, doesn't even matter. All the guys were accessible, man. There wasn't these paparazzis. There wasn't entourage. Go ahead.
When the Fillmore was going on, you know, those bands went on stage and all their friends went on stage with them and just stood around.
Right.
Some of them danced, you know. Some of them passed joints amongst themselves and with the band. But, you know, the San Francisco scene was about the deformalizing show business. It was about going on stage in the same clothes you wore to the gig. It was about playing music and being about the music and about the music only. And how it was part of a tribal rite. It was Chet Helms, the guy from the Avalon. He had this whole thing about how that a Dionysian rite took place under a proscenium stage with spotlights. That the proscenium stage had the arch, which was the gateway to the gods, and you were to gaze upon the people that were framed by this proscenium with some kind of reverence. But a Dionysian revel made no distinction between those people on the stage and those people in the audience. And then he points out that the San Francisco acid rock dances were the Dionysian revel. Light shows covered the whole environment. There were no spotlights. There was no proscenium. The stages weren't even very tall. They were about 3 feet. So you could really, you know, just step right up. And you know, if you were standing in the crowd, you could see a guitar player's shoulders. Right?
Oh,
so it was all a very community-based event. And that was part of the sort of underlying ethos of the music itself, right? All this is of one cloth. The presentation, the performance, the content, the characters, the lifestyle, the personal politics, all of this is part of this San Francisco mentality of 1966 to 69.
Before I let you go, can you just talk to me about, like, your impression when you wrote this book about Southern California and the sort of the unsung female characters? I mean, can you talk about your initial impressions? And I'm talking about in the whenever you first got down to Southern California. And in hindsight, looking at this book, were there things that were surprising to you? I just remember like people like David Garibaldi. Again, he's a musician, but Tower. Great David Rubinson story with that too, when he took over San Francisco Records. But by the '80s, the drug use in the band was crazy, and Garibaldi split for Southern California, and the one thing that really bothered him was like there were no bands. He wound up working in a band with Tim Weston, but it was just a different vibe, and I just wonder what your impressions were like of Los Angeles, when you first tasted it, and how, and if anything was sort of surprised you in doing research for this book about maybe the biases you had towards it because you're a Berkeley cat and a Marin County cat, and what actually is really there.
So. I don't have the stereotypical snobbery about Southern California that's so common up here in San Francisco.
Right.
I love Southern California, love Los Angeles, love Hollywood. I first went there in 1960 as a 10-year-old to visit my auntie, and it was a mecca. It was a tropical paradise. It was unbelievable. And over the years, I came to, deepen my relationship with that. I went to school in Southern California in 69 and 70, and that's where I started getting immersed in the record business down there, and the clubs and the music scene. And real quickly, I understood that as exciting and fun and now as Hollywood was, that there was an industrial slant over the cultural slant in San Francisco.
Wow.
That everybody was looking to make a record deal and to be successful, and it wasn't like ideas that were being tossed around. Tower of Power, they were an idea, right? They weren't just another band. They were an idea. And that Creedence Clearwater was an idea. The Sly and the Family Stone was an idea. Santana was an idea, right? And the fact that they were ultimately successful to the degree they were was just a result of how the ideas played out. But it wasn't about the success; it was about the ideas. So that was the distinction between Los Angeles and San Francisco. I saw it's not so altogether a bad thing, right?
Right.
Because that's where the Eagles come from, and the Eagles would not have come from San Francisco. They're not a cultural institution.
Right.
They are an industrial institution. And the Eagles were going on in Los Angeles about the same time the Tubes were going on in San Francisco. Couldn't imagine two less alike bands. But that's well, Robin Williams called San Francisco a human game preserve, and there's a certain amount of truth to that.
Yeah, I mean, is there something to be said? Greg Errico from Sly Stone told me that he remembers growing up when San Francisco was just a little city on the hill. People used to come 10-mile radius just to come and enjoy the scenery and vacation, or come and visit and eat good food. But he said it was a nest that eventually hatched all these ideas. I guess it would be what you were saying, Sly Stone, the idea that the Mission District, Michael Carabello, and do you think it's fair to say that San Francisco was a nest for about 10 years before all these quote unquote ideas came to fruition?
Oh, it's a good description. I like that. But, San Francisco goes back beyond the hippie thing, too,
That's what I mean,
in the 50s, it was a cauldron of very specific kind of fluid jazz, most represented by Dave Brubeck, and then his drummer, Cal Jader.
We got to talk about that, man. Jesus. Oh, God, yeah. Jesus.
Capitalized on the Brazilian thing. I mean, all that was like, so outside of New York and the jazz establishment. again, here's San Francisco, the far West Coast, the final resting place of 5,000 years of Western civilization. So all that was going on. Then the whole revolution in nightclub comics took place in San Francisco. Plus, then all the folk music uproar. Now that a lot of that came out of New York and Boston. We know that, but it really started with the Kingston Trio coming out of the San Francisco nightclub scene.
Absolutely. Healy said the other thing is, did you know? I just connected with his son and did 2 interviews. But one of the guys who, he taught Barry Melton, he taught Greg Douglas from Steve Miller. This guy, the older shaman guitar player from Antioch, Larry Miller. Does that name ring a bell?
No, I thought you were going to say Barry Olivier, who was
who's
the
that?
Berkeley guitar teacher.
Barry Olivier. Who's Barry Olivier?
Barry Olivier, yeah, he was the director of the Berkeley Folk Festival for many years.
Wow.
But he was just the guy that taught everybody how to play guitar in Berkeley. The first lesson was Midnight Special.
Wow.
And, you went home and learned how to play Midnight Special. I think it's 2 chords. And John Fogerty was a recipient of that lesson. Of course, many years later, he recorded Midnight Special on some multi-platinum Creedence Clearwater record. I always thought that was cute that Barry Olivier's, introductory lesson worked so well with John.
Selvin, let's do another set before the end of maybe around Hanukkah time. It would be great to do, and I'm going to get you Keltner. You still want to get in touch with Keltner?
Yeah, I'd love an email address. That'd be really good.
You got it, man. You got it. And
that'd be good.
It will. Yeah. I can give you a minute. You prefer that over?
I got a book proposal floating around.
Really? Okay. Yeah. I mean, what? I'll hip you to that. And
I want to write. I want to write a book about Jim Gordon.
Well, he's still alive, man. I don't know if he's not talking to anybody, but he's in yeah. I mean, I know Keltner talked about.
He's in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, he's in Vacaville, and he's not in all that great shape. He's mentally ill.
I think it's one of the most compelling stories. I have some great audio of Keltner talking about. I'll send it to you about. Because one of the few bands that did play double drums doesn't get a lot of exposure is Mad Dogs and Englishmen with Joe Cocker, and
yeah, Keltner was holding on for dear life.
Exactly. No, he's talking about Joe
Keltner. Yeah. Keltner's entire style is based on what Jim does. It's just Jim Gordon was just a giant in the field, just a giant. It's like why Don and Phil heard him when he was 17 years old and just snapped him right the fuck up. He'd never played with anybody in his life.
It's really Keltner was just talking about his wrists and how thin his wrists were compared to Gordon. Gordon had a more military style of drumming. I would just argue that Jim Gordon could play great jazz. Keltner really came from that jazz aesthetic as well. I venture to say that they had a lot of mutual admiration for each other. But yeah, I mean, a book on Jim Gordon, absolutely. Selvin needs to be writing that book immediately. That's an epic read.
I've got a proposal that's shopping right now, and it's I'm very big on it. It's a really incredible story, and Keltner's a huge part of it. Oddly enough, they were so associated, and yeah, Keltner came out of the jazz field, and he took all his cues from Jim. Jim played with the Paige Cavanaugh band.
Right.
He played jazz to beat your life. He started at age 8, and he was trained in every realm of instruments. He took mallet instruments from Earl Hatz, who's like the guy at UCLA, and he would take Bach home and do Bach on the marimba.
Much love to you, Selvin. We will be in touch, brother.
Jake, this is great. Anytime, man. You're a crack up. Don Barksdale, man.
Dude, Barksdale and the streets of Paris, man. The streets of Paris, and also there was a barbecue joint down there too. That's pretty hip. Yeah, man. Much love to you. We'll do it again, brother.
All right, Jake.
All right, cheers. Peace. Later. Part 2 in the books with Joel Selvin. Putting one foot in front of the other here. That's it for the Jake Feinberg Show. We'll see you later.